We need a new system. We need a new society. We need to demand that which may have sounded impossible even a few weeks ago, but is not only realizable, but an imperative necessity. Israel is at war with Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, and now Iran. More than 180 Iranian missiles struck Israel on Tuesday. For the last year, Israel has carried out a non-stop killing spree in Gaza. That war is now part of a larger regional war in the Middle East. Today, we'll talk about what comes next. Welcome to the Socialist Program. I'm your host, Brian Becker. Today, we're talking with Ben Norton. Ben is an investigative journalist currently based in Beijing, China. He is the editor of the independent news website Geopolitical Economy Report, which you can find at geopoliticaleconomy.com. Ben Norton, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Brian. It's one of my favorite programs, so it's always a pleasure being here.
Well, thank you so much for joining once again. The whole world witnessed on Tuesday Iranian missiles coming down into the heart of Israel, 180 missiles. The Iranian foreign minister invoked Article 51 of the UN Charter, meaning that Iran was acting in self-defense. Israel had assassinated Ismail Haniyeh, the political leader of Gaza, the chief negotiator with Israel, purportedly for a ceasefire. The Israelis assassinated him in Iran while he was visiting Iran to take part in the inauguration ceremonies for the new Iranian president. At that time, Iran said it would retaliate. It said it was also retaliating for the assassination of Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah. Of course, Israel has carried out many assassinations in Lebanon. But Ben, we are in a regional war, and it's not simply Israel's regional war against Gaza, West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, and Iran. This is the United States. You've written about it. You've talked about it. This is the United States 100%, not 99%, 100% behind this war effort by the Israeli regime. Anyway, let's talk about it. And as the show goes on, we're going to talk about what the impact is, not only for the Palestinian and Lebanese and Iranian people, not only for the region, but for the entire planet. But I want to get your take.
That's absolutely right, Brian. I mean, Israel really acts as a kind of attack dog for the U.S. empire. The former U.S. Secretary of State, Alexander Haig, under Ronald Reagan, famously referred to Israel as an unsinkable aircraft carrier for the U.S. empire. And U.S. President Biden has repeatedly claimed over decades that Israel is so important for U.S. strategic interests, that is imperial interests, that if Israel did not exist, the United States would have to create an Israel in order to try to maintain hegemonic control over what is one of the most strategic regions on Earth. Of course, there are many reasons, including the very large natural resources, oil and gas, the geostrategic location of West Asia, the so-called Middle East, which has numerous trade choke points, like in connecting through Egypt, the Suez Canal, also the Strait of Hormuz that Iran could potentially block off, through which a lot of oil is traded internationally. So the U.S. sees this region as extremely important for its attempt to maintain a global empire, to maintain a chokehold on the global trade system and commodities markets. And Israel acts as the 51st U.S. state, an extension of the U.S. empire in this very important region. And you mentioned some of the countries that Israel and the U.S. are at war with. And in fact, it's kind of easy to forget because the list is so long, but there's also Yemen. Israel has been bombing Yemen. Of course, the U.S. has also been bombing Yemen. And there's, of course, Iraq. The resistance forces in Iraq that helped to defeat ISIS have also been attacked by the U.S. and Israel. So the U.S. and Israel are at war with almost every country in the region, at least any country that's not a complete puppet. Jordan is an absolute monarchy, but it's run by a U.S. puppet, so they never complain about what's going on there. So as for this Israeli attack in Lebanon. I mean, this is a massive escalation of what Israel has been doing, not just for the past year, but for decades. Of course, Israel has invaded Lebanon now 3 times. This is the 3rd time. And when Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982, it maintained an illegal military occupation of South Lebanon for 2 decades. Israel was expelled in 2000 after years of resistance by the indigenous resistance in Lebanon, which was led by Hezbollah. Where does Hezbollah come from? Hezbollah was founded in the 1980s in response to Israel's illegal military occupation of Lebanon. So Israel bears responsibility for the creation of these resistance groups. If Israel didn't attack its neighbors, try to colonize their land, occupy their land, there would be no need for these resistance groups. But then Israel cites the existence of these groups to try to justify further aggression, further colonial conquest. The Minister of Diaspora Affairs for the Israeli regime he posted this long tweet in Hebrew, and he said, "We do not recognize Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon as sovereign states." He said that. So Israel is essentially saying, we are not only at war with these countries, they don't exist to us. We want to colonize them. And he openly called for Israel to reoccupy South Lebanon like it did in the 1980s and 90s. We're talking about a murderous rogue regime run by far-right extremists who have the full support of the U.S. empire from both parties, Democrats and Republicans. And we see these parties competing to see who can be more pro-Israel. So Trump and the Republicans claim that Biden and Harris supposedly are not pro-Israeli enough. And let's not forget, in the presidential debate, Trump said that Biden is a Palestinian as an insult, which is insulting in so many levels. It's obviously racist, but it's also so insulting because Biden has been doing as much as he can to kill Palestinian children in Gaza. Biden has given more than $18 billion in military aid to Israel in the past year alone. And every war crime committed by Israel has been facilitated by the United States using U.S. planes, U.S. bombs, U.S. missiles, U.S. guns and ammunition. And the U.S. has protected Israel on the international stage at the UN Security Council, vetoing any resolution that calls for ceasefire or peace, even vetoing the internationally recognized call for Palestine to be admitted as a full member. You can look at the votes in the UN General Assembly where 2/3 or more of the entire world votes in support of Palestine, and the US and 6 or 7 proxy regimes vote in support of Israel. I mean, it's absolutely outlandish seeing what's happening. And the last thing that I'll add here is that it's not just this genocide in Gaza, which has been recognized by top UN experts, including the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Palestinians and the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Access to Food. Both of them have said that this is a genocide. Of course, the International Court of Justice, the top UN legal authority, is investigating Israel on charges of genocide in a case that was brought by South Africa, a victim of an apartheid regime that was also sponsored by the US and Israel. It's not just all of that, but obviously the US has been supporting all of this. But now that Israel is waging this war of aggression on Lebanon, invading Lebanon, the Pentagon has released statement after statement saying, we are supporting Israel in what it's doing. Politico published an article revealing that the White House, behind the scenes, encouraged Israel to invade Lebanon. So they're actively pushing Israel to expand this imperial war of conquest. And let's not forget as well that Israel started this by launching a terror attack inside Lebanon, which they claimed was only against Hezbollah, but many civilians were killed, little children were killed when Israel put explosives in civilian technology, in pagers and walkie-talkies, an extreme act of terrorism that even the former CIA, the former director of CIA, the master of terrorism, even Leon Panetta admitted this was an act of terrorism. We're talking about the use of terrorism, genocide, wars of conquest, invasion, colonialism. The worst possible crimes you can imagine are being carried out by Israel with the full support of the U.S. empire. Biden was just asked about Israel's invasion of Lebanon, and Biden repeated 3 times. He said, we fully support what Israel is doing. He said, fully, fully, fully. I don't know how something can be full 3 times, but it shows how much the U.S. empire is committed to propping up this unsinkable aircraft carrier as it's just committing this rampage across the region.
Ben, I think it's really important for people in the United States, people everywhere, but especially in the United States, where we're inundated with bourgeois, capitalist, imperialist propaganda, which is imperialist. It's also racist, but it's also designed to deceive the people of the United States. It's fundamentally designed to deceive. And it sometimes, frequently, comes across as news, as objective news from the independent media, but they all echo the same line, they use the same language, and it's always intended to deceive people. You know, we're the socialist program. I frequently quote, one of my favorite quotes from Lenin is that people will always be the victims of deceit or self-deception unless they realize that behind every political statement, every political, religious, educational declaration made by the powers that be, that behind all of that there is a class force, a class interest, that the United States isn't carrying out this regime, the regime change operations in the Middle East, the endless war against the people of the Middle East, simply because it's brutal, simply because it's cruel, simply because it's the great friend of Israel, simply because it loves Jewish people so much that it considers any assault on Israel to be like an assault on Jewish people. All of these things are basically propaganda lines for the purposes of deceit and, for those who buy it, self-deception. Now, one of the big areas of deceit and self-deception for those who were suckers enough to accept it was the idea that the Biden administration was sort of caught between a rock and a hard place when it came to Netanyahu and his endless war against the Palestinians. And you made the point in one of your recent posts that Israel has dropped 70,000 tons of bombs on Gaza between October and June, October 2023 and June 2024. And that was more bombs than were dropped by the Nazis on London during World War II. And Gaza is a small place. It's 5 miles wide, 25 miles long. To drop 70,000 tons of bombs on this area, I mean, you can't use any other language except genocide to describe something like that. But during this entire time period, the U.S. has said, we really want a ceasefire. Biden kept saying, you know, too many civilians have been killed. We're really, we're unhappy that Netanyahu isn't listening to us, that we need more dialogue, that we're committed to a ceasefire. Sometimes we saw him eating an ice cream cone and saying sort of cavalierly, yeah, there's going to be a ceasefire next week. And then he warned Netanyahu that we have a red line, and that's the invasion of Rafah in the southern part of Gaza. Don't cross that. And then Netanyahu immediately started bombing Rafah and invaded Rafah and killed so many people in Rafah. And the U.S. did nothing. So the message was always like, Biden just can't, you know, he can't convince Netanyahu to do what Biden wants him to do. I want to play a clip. This is from this week, or the last days. It's Matthew Miller, the spokesperson for this State Department, for the Secretary of State. He's being asked by a journalist about the U.S. support for Israel's invasion of Lebanon, what the U.S. position is on a ceasefire. Does the U.S. really want a ceasefire? Listen, I want everybody to listen to Matthew Miller. It's one of those rare moments where, in spite of the deceit and then the subsequent self-deception, you actually get the truth. Sometimes it just slips through. Let's listen.
How does this precedent of Rafah portend for Lebanon?
So every conflict is different, but if you look at what we continue to engage with Israel about when it comes to Lebanon, is ensuring that they have the ability to attack terrorist targets, terrorist infrastructure, a terrorist organization, but ultimately we want to see a diplomatic resolution.
Well, was that the case with Rafah, for instance, not just in Rafah, but...
We've never wanted to see a diplomatic resolution with Hamas.
Oh, wait, you're for a ceasefire, but you never wanted a diplomatic resolution with Hamas. Well, Wouldn't that be absolutely the path to a ceasefire? I mean, this is the parsed. Normally, we get parsed language. Here's a rare moment, Ben, where you can actually hear the truth about the U.S. position over the past year.
Absolutely. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. But just because, Brian, you mentioned this incredible fact that more than 70,000 tons of bombs have been dropped on Gaza. This is a figure that was reported by the Financial Times, which noted, and this was back in June, it noted that Gaza is the most densely bombed area in modern history. Out of all of the horrific wars of the 20th century, Gaza has been more densely bombed than even many cities that were bombed in World War II. I mean, it's absolutely horrifying seeing what's going on. And the U.S. has played the leading role in this. Every Palestinian killed, all of the tens of thousands of children killed in Gaza have been killed not only with the support of Israel, but with the support of the United States. This is a U.S.-Israeli war. Haaretz, the leading Israeli newspaper, reported, citing top Israeli military officials, that were it not for U.S. support, Israel could not wage this war. And that was on Gaza. Certainly that's true for Lebanon as well. Not only because Israel needs the constant supply of billions of dollars of weapons and ammunition and planes and bombs, but also because if the U.S. stopped protecting Israel on the international stage, it would actually face consequences. That's why, the International Criminal Court, which has a long history of being very biased, basically only going after African leaders. Finally, the prosecutor Karim Khan released these accusations of charges of crimes against humanity against Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. That was months ago, and the ICC has not actually applied for the arrest warrant because Western countries, primarily the US, but also the UK, have been lobbying the ICC and telling it not to, which is ironic because the US is not even a member of the ICC. But anyway, getting back to your point about diplomacy, this is one of the most cynical propaganda campaigns I've seen laundered through the corporate media in the past year. So essentially, the way it works is that the Biden administration has a few stenographers in different media outlets, and they constantly leak these stories claiming that Biden had a stern call with Netanyahu, and he said, Bibi, we need peace. I'm angry with you. Go ahead and sign a peace deal. And then the U.S. immediately signed off another $1 billion of weapons for Israel. But the media has tried to craft this narrative that Biden's doing everything he can, but it's simply big bad Netanyahu is just getting in the way. And Blinken is doing everything he can, but Israel is just so intransigent. So they're putting all the blame on Netanyahu, who obviously is an odious, reprehensible war criminal. But Biden and Blinken are also war criminals, and they're essentially trying to scapegoat Netanyahu for their complicity in facilitating Netanyahu's crimes and giving him a green light and carte blanche to do whatever he wants, to carry out genocide. So it's a way that Biden and, of course, Kamala Harris, now that she's running for president, they can tell their left-wing critics, at least a few of them, who at least pretend, some people in the Democratic Party who are a little uncomfortable with the fact that their party is supporting genocide. So they, say we should be a little less pro-Israel and maybe have more of an equal approach and talk about Palestinians. Well, then Biden and Kamala can say to them, well, look, we're trying to stop this war, but we can't do anything because it's all Netanyahu. But in reality, we know from so many reports that behind the scenes, the White House, including Biden and Kamala Harris, have given a complete green light to everything that Israel's doing, because it's not just Israel acting on behalf of Israel's idea of its interests, which are colonial interests, but because Israel is acting on behalf of U.S. imperial interests to try to expand U.S. and Western hegemony across this region where for decades there have been so many resistance forces. And Israel has been the attack dog that was used by the U.S. empire to try to liquidate any progressive, revolutionary, anti-imperialist force in the region, whether that was the communist movement, especially the Palestinian communist groups like the PFLP. By the way, while Israel has been carrying out these terrorist attacks in Lebanon and assassinating political leaders, not only has it assassinated political leaders from Hezbollah, which is a registered political party in Lebanon, it has democratically elected representatives in the parliament, but Israel has also been killing leaders of the PFLP, which is a Palestinian socialist group, but Israel has been killing them because Israel's goal is to liquidate all of the leaders in the region who oppose Israeli colonialism and U.S. imperialism. Israeli colonialism being one of the projects of the U.S. empire. Of course, Israel goes back to the British Empire. It was the British Empire that gave the green light to the creation of Israel through the Balfour Declaration in 1917, which was signed a year after the Sykes-Picot Agreement that was exposed by the Bolsheviks after the revolution in Russia. In 1916, the British, the French, and the Russian Tsarist Empire carved up the Middle East, West Asia, and the British Empire said, we'll get Palestine, and the French said, we're going to get Lebanon, we'll get, they'll carve up the other countries in the region. So a year later, the British says, we're going to allow the creation of this colony, this Zionist colonial project in Palestine, the historic homeland of the Palestinian people. And then after World War II, and especially after 1967, Israel moves into the U.S. imperial orbit and becomes a U.S. imperial protectorate, as the former U.S. Secretary of State Alexander Haig said, an unsinkable aircraft carrier for the U.S. empire. And here we are today, Israel's longest-serving prime minister, Netanyahu, by the way, is an American. It's not often known. People forget, why does Netanyahu speak with an American accent? He spent the most formative years of his life in the U.S. He was educated in high school and college in the U.S. He got his first job in Boston working with Mitt Romney in consulting. And then he gave up his citizenship to become involved in Israeli politics. But then he moved back to the U.S. and got citizenship again before giving up his citizenship a second time to become Israel's prime minister. So Netanyahu is an American. That's why he's also so close to the Republican Party. He has been lifelong friends, or at least for his adult life, been friends with many Republican leaders. I mean, it's really the perfect symbol of what Israel is in this region. And it's constantly at war with every progressive force. So they liquidated the communists, and then the Arab nationalist forces were also attacked by Israel. Israel tried to liquidate all of the Arab nationalist forces, including in the PLO. And then you had the rise, mostly in the 80s and 90s, of anti-imperialist Islamist forces in groups like Hezbollah, which have a kind of Islamic-oriented nationalist ideology led by people like Hassan Nasrallah, who had formed a lot of international alliances with other revolutionary movements, especially in Latin America. He was close to Hugo Chavez and praised the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela. So these are nationalist movements that are seeking national liberation. They take different forms, whether it's communism, whether it's, Arab nationalism, whether it's liberation theology. But the point is that Israel has tried to liquidate all of these revolutionary movements, which of course benefits the U.S. empire as well. And finally, as you said, Brian, of course, Washington is not acting out of benevolence. It's acting out of its own economic interests. So U.S. companies can maintain control over the region, so they can overthrow any independent leader who might try to pursue an independent path of economic development, whether it's socialism, whether it's resource nationalism that does not allow foreign corporations to privatize their financial sector, to sell off their state-owned enterprises, to privatize their natural resources. Any independent government that pursued that kind of policy, like Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, is overthrown, exterminated by the U.S., by Israel. They're really part of the same imperial project.
Ben, the two parties are basically speaking with one voice here when it comes to Israel. They're, as you mentioned earlier, they're kind of dueling with each other to see who can be more belligerent, more vociferous in support of Israel. Trump the other day said if he was president and if Iran, basically he threatened explicitly to obliterate or bomb to smithereens, in Trump's eloquent language, bomb to smithereens all of Iran's cities. So they're promoting a genocide against the people of Iran. Now, Iran is a big country. It's got 90 million people. It's got a very formidable military. It's acted prudently, actually, in response to many, many targeted assassinations of its leaders, its military leaders, its scientists. I mean, there's a campaign of terror launched, I think, by the United States and Israel against Iran that's gone on for many years. And I want to sort of probe this a little bit. there's different elements of the U.S.-Iran relations that have to be examined. But of course, you will remember that General Soleimani, who was Iran's foremost military leader, or one of them, and who was going to Baghdad in early January as part of a peace mission to see if there could be a negotiated end to strife in the Middle East. He was invited by the Iraqi government. The U.S. is occupying Iraq. The U.S. knew that Soleimani was coming to the airport. I think it was January 3rd, 2020. And Trump ordered his assassination. So he came to the airport, got out of the plane, or got into a car to drive to these peace talks, and a U.S. drone came and obliterated the car, destroyed it. Now, just if the shoe was on the other foot, everybody, if, let's say, Iran invited or knew about a U.S. military leader, a top general, coming to a third country, and just decided because they determined that this U.S. general was involved in terrorist activities overseas, as the U.S. claimed falsely about Soleimani, that Iran just decided to kill them, blow their car up at an airport. Of course, the U.S. would go to war. There's no way the U.S. would not go to war. It would be a full-scale war, no matter what. Now, what the Iranians did after the killing of Soleimani is they said, we're going to retaliate, and they did retaliate. They struck 11 or 12 or maybe more U.S. military bases in Iraq, and they showed that they could penetrate U.S. air defenses, and quite a number of U.S. soldiers were wounded. But they also carried out the attack in a way not to completely destroy those bases, which they could have done. In other words, they were sending a message to Washington: if you hit us, you have many valuable so-called assets, meaning U.S. troops stationed all over this area. There's 40,000 U.S. troops in the region. We can kill them if we want to. We can hit them. We can penetrate your defenses. But we're not doing that, but we're showing you that we can do that. And so they bombed these American military bases in Iraq. And at that time, Ben, the Answer Coalition, which I'm part of, was organizing mass demonstrations. Tens of thousands of people came out into the streets immediately. It looked like there would be a major war with Iran, and the masses of people in the United States were against a new war. We were starting to organize big protests. But after about 2 weeks, Trump made it clear that they were not going to retaliate for Iran's retaliation for the killing of Soleimani. So the Iranian military hit the American military bases, and Trump stepped back. The big, bold, audacious, bragging, conceited, megalomaniac Donald Trump, who said that they're now going to obliterate Iranian cities, he actually stepped back because the U.S. ruling class was afraid of a regional war with Iran. That was very instructive. So Iran had a measured response, but it sent a message to Washington, and that message landed because the U.S. stepped back. So here we are now.
That's absolutely right.
Here we are now, 4 years later. Iran has also, it said it hit military targets, by the way, the other day when it struck Israel. And the U.S. is saying that the Iranian missiles were shot down, that America and Israel's Iron Dome, their air defenses, caught all the Iranian missiles, that they were ineffective. But actually, Israel's official policy is that you cannot tell the truth about those damages. The Israeli Times yesterday said, we can't tell you the exact amount of damage or the locations where these missiles struck because we're not allowed to based on Israeli Defense Forces, IDF sensors. That's the law of the land in Israel. They can't tell the truth about how much damage was done. But Iran appears to have struck basically military targets. In other words, what the Iranians are trying to do is send another message, like we're prepared to fight, we're prepared to go to war, but in other words, a measured response. But now the ball is in Israel's court. In 2020, Trump stepped back. If Israel does not step back now, and it's got the U.S. behind it, there's going to be a full-scale regional war in the Middle East. That's what we're looking at right now.
That's absolutely right, Brian. And on this point of Trump threatening to obliterate Iran, in fact, the vice presidential debates were just held, and CBS began the vice presidential debates asking, the first question was, if Israel launches a preemptive strike, in scare quotes, on Iran, would you support it? And both candidates intimated that yes, that they would support it. And there was basically no difference in the response between the Democrat Tim Walz and the Republican J.D. Vance. They both just talked about how they waxed poetic on how much they love Israel and would defend Israel and its attacks. Now, it's hilarious calling this a preemptive attack because Israel has already attacked Iran many times. You've talked about the assassinations carried out inside Iranian territory. Also, before, a few months ago, Israel bombed Iran's consulate in Syria, which, according to international law, is part of its sovereign territory. That was an act of aggression and an act of war against Iran. And Iran did respond proportionately previously in a measured way. And it's very noteworthy that also in that debate, J.D. Vance criticized the Biden-Harris administration, saying that the world no longer fears us. And he said, if Trump were in power, the world would fear us again, which says a lot about what their idea of, make America great again means. It means make the U.S. the world's bully. It's the hegemon that everyone around the world is afraid of because they think the U.S. could bomb us and invade us. Of course, that's still basically the situation under the Democrats. There's not that much of a difference, but of course, they say it openly when it's a Republican, especially someone like Trump who, says the quiet part loud. When Trump was president, he boasted that he was keeping troops in Syria to take the oil. He said it like 10 times in an interview on Fox News. We're taking the oil. The oil's ours. We're taking the oil. So as for the Biden administration, the Biden administration, including Biden himself and Kamala Harris, praised Israel for assassinating the Lebanese resistance leader Hassan Nasrallah and openly gave the green light for Israel to invade Lebanon. And they immediately condemned this Iranian counter-response, erasing the fact that Iran was acting proportionately in self-defense, and that unlike Israel, Iran only went after military targets. There, of course, as you said, Israel has a military censor, so the media in Israel is basically all state media. Not that the U.S. media is really independent. We know that the U.S. media claims to be independent, but also echoes the propaganda of the CIA and the Pentagon. But especially in the case of Israel, they don't even pretend that their media is independent. The military censor is very strong. But they have not claimed that any civilians were killed. And Iran has said very clearly that they were going after military targets and only military targets. So it actually says a lot about how the Western propaganda narrative is in fact the complete polar inversion of reality. The US government absurdly claims that Iran is a so-called state sponsor of terrorism, which means nothing. I mean, let's not forget, the South African anti-apartheid leader Nelson Mandela was on the US so-called terrorist list until 2008, over a decade after he became president of post-apartheid South Africa. So the US claims any political leader or any political group that opposes the U.S. empire is a so-called terrorist. That's why they claim Cuba supposedly supports terrorism. It's a nonsensical term. But meanwhile, Iran only hits military targets, whereas Israel has been carrying out genocide, massacring women and children who have been the majority of the victims in Gaza. So that, for me, I think that fact alone, when people, of course, a lot of people don't know about this because of the propaganda in the Western media. But when people do learn about that, I think it's a very eye-opening moment.
A lot of people, in the run-up to the November election, Ben, people who are fearful that Trump will launch mass deportation against immigrants, an openly, explicitly racist policy. that he will, as he said, obliterate Iranian cities, that he will go to war again against Muslim people, as he, inaugurated his first term in 2006, well, before he took office, right after the election in 2016, said he was going to ban Muslims. His position on abortion rights, there's so many issues that Donald Trump is just such an extreme reactionary, and the Republican Party is such an extremely reactionary organization. So people think like, okay, I don't like the Democrats' policy. I don't like genocide. I don't support what the Biden-Harris administration have done regarding Israel. I don't like that, but given the options, we have to choose the lesser evil. Now, okay, that's an understandable argument in American politics in one way, because absent a parliamentary system, it's a winner-take-all. It's the two ruling class parties. You have independent socialist candidates like Claudia de la Cruz and Karina Garcia from the Party for Socialism and Liberation. There's, of course, Jill Stein, Cornel West, people who have an independent position, but they're not allowed into the debates. They're, basically the Democrats are at war against the socialist candidates. They've expelled Claudia from the ballot in Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Ohio now, even though the petitioners had met all the requirements. So people think, okay, we don't have real options about who's going to win, so we can have either a protest vote to say no, or we can vote for the lesser evil. Okay, so that's we all know this is the dynamically bad nature of American democracy, the tortured form of American democracy. But I want to highlight for people that Dick Cheney, who was the architect of the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, when he was vice president for George W. Bush, who all Democrats hated as a terrible war criminal. People made movies about him. They talked about Cheney was the real evil force behind George W. Bush, that Bush wasn't smart enough to be that evil. They took Cheney's intelligence to be that evil. That's what everybody knew that 20 years ago. But now Cheney is supporting Kamala Harris. So are 300 other national security officials, many of whom were Republicans in the Bush-Cheney administration, who carried out all these heinous crimes in the Middle East. They're supporting Kamala Harris not for any other reason than they think Donald Trump, because he's an unpredictable figure, because he's mainly only concerned about Trump. He might do things that somehow sort of departs from the dominant narrative of ruling class imperialist politics, like when he started to negotiate with Kim Jong-un for a possible peace treaty in Korea. So they don't want him only because he's unpredictable. But I'm saying to people who, don't want Trump, how can you support an administration, the Harris-Walz administration, if it's got the support of Dick Cheney and all of these other warmongers? And as we get closer and closer to the election, you see Matthew Miller and Harris herself and Tim Walz echoing all of the lines of what used to be branded as the neoconservative politics of the George W. Bush administration. These are now the politics, the essence of the politics of the Democratic Party, which doesn't mean that Trump isn't bad, but it does mean that the Democrats offer no solution if you care about genocide, racism, colonialism, oppression, all of the manifestations of contemporary capitalism and imperialism. And in the case of the expanding regional war in the Middle East, this can't be more stark.
That's absolutely right. People have to ask themselves, where do you draw the line when in supporting the so-called lesser evil? What kind of evil is no longer justifiable? Is genocide a justifiable lesser evil? The Biden-Harris administration has been sponsoring a genocide. I mean, we get to the point where people keep saying lesser evil, lesser evil. Well, the evil gets so bad that even the lesser evil is so beyond the pale that there is no way of justifying these crimes. And it's also something that people need to think about in the medium to the long term. Of course, U.S. bourgeois so-called democracy, which is not a democracy, it's a plutocracy. And the so-called capitalist democracy is a system in which rich billionaire oligarchs control the system. They buy politicians through so-called campaign contributions. Then they create policy through lobbying, especially after Citizens United, the Supreme Court ruling, just opened the floodgates for an infinite amount of bribery, which is legal in the U.S. In many countries, what happens in U.S. politics is illegal, but it's just common. It's how politics is done in Washington. But even aside from all of that, people need to think, of course, bourgeois democracy in the U.S. prioritizes only the short term. So people only think in 2 or 4 year cycles. But we need to think about what the medium to long-term effects are on U.S. society, which is becoming more and more violent, more and more extreme. We see so much systemic structural violence just everywhere you look. And whether it's the police brutality against Black people, against Latinos, against indigenous nations, whether it's the homelessness, which, I mean, it's just so overwhelming in big cities. It's just incredible. And when you travel around the world, as I fortunately have had the opportunity to do, you can see that it's not normal. In most other big cities, even in the global south, even in very poor countries, you don't see this kind of extreme homelessness. Now, there are, of course, people living in, shanty towns and such, but they at least have something over their head. I mean, the barbarism of capitalism in the US is just so extreme and in your face. And then when it comes to healthcare and the price gouging, and then now, if you look at Wall Street, with the growing inequality and asset managers buying up apartment blocks. And now one of the main funders of Donald Trump, the highest paid corporate executive on Wall Street, Steven Schwartzman, who's the CEO of the asset manager and private equity fund Blackstone. This is the largest corporate landlord on earth. They have 300,000 housing units that they own in the US. These corporate landlords are just taking over huge parts of housing in the US and charging exorbitant rates. So increasingly, landlords were already bad enough when you had some horrible slumlord who refused to fix a broken faucet. But now you don't even have a real person as your landlord. Your landlord is this abstract corporate monstrosity on Wall Street that is sucking wealth out of everything and giving it to a small handful of oligarchs. The point is that U.S. society is becoming so brutal, and the Democrats say you just have to keep voting for us because we're the lesser evil. And every 4 years, every 2 years, every 4 years, politics keeps lurching to the right, moving to the right, moving to the right. I remember very well when Bush was president, because for me, that was my political awakening. I was a teenager. I remember going to protest against the Iraq War. It was really an eye-opening moment. That and the financial crisis made me who I am. I mean, and I think for my generation, there are a lot of people seeing the flagrant violation of international law. The U.S. killed more than 1 million Iraqis in a war of aggression. I mean, that changed me. And then the 2008 financial crisis caused by these neoliberal policies. I mean, you can see the barbarism of the U.S. regime. I mean, this is not a democratic government, it's a regime. And then you can see that the political class says, well, every few years, you just have to support the Democrats because they're a lesser evil, even though they keep normalizing the worst crimes of 20 years ago. So now, rightfully, the Democrats wanted nothing to do with George Bush in the 2000s. And there was all this in pop culture. There was this great moment of all this anti-Bush, anti-Bush kind of like cultural moment. You saw like bands like Green Day, American Idiot, all this stuff. It was very popular, right? Everyone hated Bush. It was like cool to be anti-Bush. And then now here we are less than 20 years later, and the Democratic Party is praising Bush and the most blood-soaked criminal neoconservatives in his administration and saying, yeah, they support us. So we have the biggest possible tent imaginable. So what worries me, imagine in 20 years from now, they're going to be rehabilitating Donald Trump when we have Adolf Hitler 2.0. I mean, of course, I shouldn't be flippant about these things. They can be very dangerous, obviously, but you get the point I'm getting at. People keep acting like Trump is the worst possible thing that could ever exist. But we now see open white supremacists, open fascist forces in the Republican Party who not only talk about mass deportations of undocumented immigrants, they're talking about deportations of citizens who are Black citizens, Latino citizens. They want to create a white ethno state. I mean, we're talking about extreme fascistic politics becoming more and more mainstream in the US. And people expect that, oh, well, if we just vote for the broad tent of the neoconservatives and the right-wing Democrats, then we'll just eventually things will be better. But how are things going to get better? I've been told this my entire life. Keep voting for the lesser evil and things will get better. And we got to the point where now the same people who said we have to vote for the lesser evil against George Bush are now saying we have to vote for George Bush's allies because they're the lesser evil. There's no end to that logic. At some point, you have to draw a line. And if you don't draw the line at genocide, unfortunately, I don't think people will ever draw the line.
Yes, I agree with you. In the other element of this, I want to turn to another topic in a moment, but another element of this, of course, Ben, is that the United States has been so racist and premised, it's the capitalist system here, and the country's existence has been premised on racism against Black America, against the Black community, against indigenous people. The fact that, it took 200 years for a Black person, a Black man in the case of Barack Obama, to become president. I mean, many people in Black America were understandably feeling like this is a step forward against racism, because finally, after hundreds of years of first slavery and Jim Crow, and then just brutal racism of all types, to have a Black man named Barack Obama become president, that's a sign. And the fact that so many white people even voted for Barack Obama is also a sign of progress. In the case of Kamala Harris, if she becomes president, she'll be the first Black woman to be president and the first woman to become president. So those are understandable, sentiments, because the fight against racism and sexism has been, but racism in America, especially targeting Black America, has been such a principal vehicle for the emergence of capitalism and imperialism. So this is the dilemma of U.S. politics. It's a complicated dilemma in many ways, but I think what we're trying to emphasize here is that if we're supporting the Democratic Party, not because of who their candidate is or isn't, not the personality, not the person themselves, but the institution of the Democratic Party, it is a capitalist ruling class institution. It is at the center of imperialism. And the Republican Party is at the center of imperialism. And in that sense, people don't really have an option, because if you're voting for them, if you're supporting either party, you're ending up basically forced to vote for those parties that are going to oppress you and oppress other people around the world. I mean, Lenin said the bourgeois democracy, people have the opportunity every few years, 2 or 4 in the case of the United States, to vote for who will oppress them for the next period of time. That's the variety offered the working class and oppressed people under the system of capitalism. Anyway, I want to turn to another topic as we sort of move towards the end here. Ben, I want to go back to the geopolitics of this. And you and your all of your work, your studies are premised on a geopolitical assessment. You do amazing work. I want people at the end, we'll tell people again how to go to your website, because you're looking at geostrategic and economic trends on a global scale. And I think they're so important, the contributions you're making. But let's go back to this geostrategic sort of intervention on the part of Barack Obama back in 2011, where he was trying to bring U.S. troops and was bringing U.S. troops out of Iraq after they had invaded in 2003. And he said in Australia, it's time for a pivot to Asia. Now, what did that mean? People weren't really certain what it meant because it was ill-defined. It was kind of like just became a slogan, pivot to Asia. Well, what it meant from a geostrategic point of view was to pivot away from endless wars that the U.S. was basically losing in the Middle East and getting bogged down in the Middle East, or in the case of Afghanistan, South Asia, or Central Asia, that the U.S. needed to move pivot towards Asia to confront China. It wasn't really like for peace. It was for another kind of confrontation, but a confrontation with China. And Obama represented a wing of the political establishment in the U.S. that made the argument, by endless wars in the Middle East, all we're doing is allowing China to rise peacefully, when what we should be doing is using our Air Force and naval power to confront and contain China so that they can't rise peacefully. I mean, that was the basic message. It wasn't immediately clear in 2011. It's certainly clear now, because the pivot to Asia has been in full swing. But the U.S. at the same time, Ben, isn't able to, or doesn't seem able to do the pivot. And I mean, it has pivoted. It has sent 60% of U.S. naval and Air Force assets to the Pacific, but it's involved in another endless war in the Middle East, bogged down in endless losing wars. And I want to talk about this dynamic because it's really an interesting and important, more not interesting so much, but an important contradiction for imperialism, for U.S. imperialism. I want to go back to 2015. And Netanyahu was, we're going to play a clip of Netanyahu speaking before Congress, or two clips actually. Here's Obama representing the U.S. ruling class saying, let's pivot to Asia. Let's get out of endless war in the Middle East. Let's have a nuclear arms deal with Iran. Let's have the beginning of semi-normalization of relations with Iran, which actually happened in 2015. And yet Netanyahu, who was then head of state of Israel, was invited by the Republicans, and the Democrats accepted, where he spoke before both houses of the U.S. Congress, completely trashing President Obama's main foreign policy objective, the sitting president of the United States. So Netanyahu comes to the U.S. Congress and basically, even though he said some nice words about Obama, which were kind of throwaway lines, basically trashing his foreign policy, and both parties rise in support and give ovation after ovation after ovation to Netanyahu as he's trashing Obama. And now here we are, less than a decade later, but Trump trashed the nuclear arms deal. Biden continued Trump's policy, and the U.S. is bogged down in another Mideast war. Let's hear Netanyahu, and then I want to get your thoughts. This is an important contradiction that haunts U.S. imperialism in its geostrategic plans. Let's listen to Netanyahu, 2015, before Congress.
Iran's goons in Gaza, its lackeys in Lebanon, its revolutionary guards on the Golan Heights are clutching Israel with three tentacles of terror. Backed by Iran, Assad is slaughtering Syrians. Backed by Iran, Shiite militias are rampaging through Iraq. Backed by Iran, Houthis are seizing control of Yemen, threatening the strategic straits at the mouth of the Red Sea. Along with the Straits of Hormuz, that would give Iran a second choke point on the world's oil supply.
Ben, I mean, at that moment, Obama was involved in negotiations to try to have an agreement with Iran. Netanyahu comes before both houses of Congress. We could have shown the 30 seconds of constant ovations for him. I mean, it was way more than 30 seconds, but sustained, almost minute-long ovation. Let's talk about this contradiction for U.S. imperialism. China is rising. Iran is stronger in spite of sanctions. Russia is back on its feet. We have all of these indications of a multipolar world, the U.S. unipolar power era following the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's not fully ended, but it's ending. Let's talk about that contradiction. I want to get your thoughts about it.
Absolutely. Well, you have to think of it also from the perspective of U.S. imperial planners, right? Because there are a lot of people in Washington whose job is to sit around and think about how the U.S. can project power around the world, try to maintain a hegemonic control over the different regions of the world. And this is something that we've seen for decades, that US imperial planners have always emphasized the importance of dividing the different powers in Asia among each other, because you can divide and conquer that way. And if you go back and read in the 1990s, the former US National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the architect of the famous proxy war in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union, in which the CIA supported the Mujahideen that became Al Qaeda and the Taliban to try to overthrow the Afghan socialist government, which was allied with the Soviet Union. Well, Brzezinski was one of these imperial strategists, along with people like Kissinger, who wrote many books. And in Brzezinski's case, he published a book in 1997, which is called The Grand Chessboard. And he perceives the world in this way, as a chessboard, and he wants the US empire to win this chess game and dominate the world. And the biggest fear that he had was expressed concern over the possibility of what he called an anti-hegemonic coalition of China, Russia, and Iran. And for decades, US policy was to try to separate China, Russia, and Iran, going back to the 1970s, when Kissinger in the Nixon administration famously oversaw the normalization of ties with China. You, Brian, have done a great series on this program on the Sino-Soviet split and the history behind that. Essentially, the U.S. was taking advantage of this very unfortunate historical tragedy of the Sino-Soviet split and trying to further increase that divide and try to normalize with China in order to isolate the Soviet Union. And they were ultimately successful in that. And when Trump came in, Trump wanted to do the exact opposite. And actually, Kissinger encouraged Trump to try to improve relations with Russia in order to try to separate Russia and China in what was known as Kissingerian triangulation, but it was the reverse of what happened in the 70s. But actually, although it is a little well known that Trump tried that, and this led to the whole Russiagate thing, which ironically sabotaged those attempts, although I think they were ultimately futile, because we've seen that Russia and China have economically integrated in so many ways. They have very complementary economies. But what also is forgotten is that part of the pivot to Asia that the Obama administration declared, this was in the first Hillary Clinton, the first term of the Obama, which was when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. Hillary Clinton also had a strategy that was referred to as the Russia reset. And famously, she met with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov with a big red button, and they pressed the button and said, we're going to reset Russia relations. And then, of course, you have the Iran nuclear deal, which the U.S., obviously, they didn't expect Iran to move into the Western camp, but they wanted Iran to try to be neutral because they were preparing for war on China. And as you often point out, Brian, I like this phrase that I've actually stolen from you sometimes. When they say pivot to Asia, they mean war in Asia. It's not a pivot to peace in Asia, it's pivot to war in Asia, and specifically war on China. And then you start having all this propaganda about the South China Sea. I remember in the 2016 presidential campaign, they were in the debates, they were just everyone in both Republican and Democratic parties were arguing about the South China Sea. And then you have all this propaganda about Taiwan, which has been part of China for hundreds of years. And when the U.S. normalized relations with China, with the People's Republic of China, the U.S. recognized that there's only one China, and that on both sides of the Taiwan Strait, they recognize that there is only one China. Taiwan is part of China. But the U.S. recognized that legally in the 3 communiques in the 70s and early 80s that established U.S. PRC relations. But in spirit, the U.S. has been violating that agreement. So the point I'm getting at here is that this has been prepared for many years. In fact, if you go even back to the Bush administration, we were talking about some of the neoconservative forces, which have now become completely bipartisan. What's interesting is that if you go back and look at some of their early documents, before 9/11, a lot of their focus was, of course, on Iran, but also on China. And this goes back to, the late 1980s and the attempt at trying to overthrow the Chinese government and the sanctions on China in 1989 and all of that. Deng Xiaoping gave a very fascinating speech in 1989. It's not very well known. And Deng Xiaoping famously said that the U.S. is starting, he said, just when we think that the Cold War is over, the U.S. is starting a new Cold War, and it's on both the socialist countries and the global South as a whole. He said that in 1989. So, idea that we're in a new Cold War is actually not so new. But the point is that, there was all this obsession with trying to, after the overthrow of the Soviet Union in 1991, in which the CIA and US played a key role, along with, traitorous forces in Moscow. Also, there was an attempt to do the same in China. And many people assumed that even if the Chinese government, the Communist Party, was not directly overthrown, that there would be some kind of Gorbachev figure who would come to power. And especially when Clinton allowed China to join the World Trade Organization in 2001, that China would, just become a complete capitalist country. Eventually, the Communist Party would be overthrown. They were obviously wrong about that. And we see that in recent years, the Communist Party always maintained a socialist line. Despite the market reforms, it still is a socialist market economy in which the state plays a key role. About 1/3 of GDP comes from state-owned enterprises, which are concentrated in the strategic commanding heights of the economy in China. The banking system is state-owned. The infrastructure companies are state-owned. The metalworking, electrical grid is all state-owned. Telecommunications is state-owned. So much of the important parts of the economy remain state-owned, following a unique socialist model. But the point is that the U.S. assumed that China would follow the same path as the former Soviet Union. It did not do so. So then the Bush administration was considering ways to try to subvert China, and then 9/11 happened, and they moved a lot of their attention to the so-called war on terror, and this essentially allowed China some more breathing room. Although, of course, the U.S. never really gave up. The National Endowment for Democracy, which is a CIA cutout, was always active, supporting, neoliberal groups in China, anti-government groups. But the point is that China it was not at the top of the list. But now what we've seen, especially in the past decade, is that China's economic rise has been absolutely remarkable. There is nothing like it in modern history. 800 million people being lifted out of poverty through a state-led anti-poverty campaign. China has also moved to the highest level in the global value chain of producing very advanced technology. And essentially, the deal was when Nixon normalized relations with China, when Clinton allowed China to join the WTO, the deal was that the U.S. would allow China to integrate into the U.S.-dominated global financial system and global trade under the condition that China would simply produce cheap consumer goods for Western markets, which was a way for the U.S. and Europe to maintain low inflation rates, despite the fact that real wages have been stagnant since the neoliberal era in about 1976. Real wages have been stagnant, but despite the fact that obviously there were very high costs of education and healthcare and housing, the average person, they did feel that in some areas, but when it came to consumer goods, when it came to household appliances, furniture, clothing, basic electronics, people felt that they at least had slightly better lives because they were able to get access to these very cheap goods that were produced in China. And basically the US deal was, we'll allow China to do that as long as China remains in this subordinated position. As long as China does not try to compete with our big tech monopolies. We'll allow outsourcing of the low value added commodities that aren't that important for our economy, but China will not be allowed to compete with our Silicon Valley monopolies. China's gotten to the point where not only is it competing, but it's actually out-competing them, which is why the US is now returning to tariffs and adopting this fantasy of the free market, which has never existed and never will exist. It's always what the dominant economic power preaches. This is what the British Empire did, but they never actually practiced free trade. So anyway, how does this relate to the US strategy in West Asia? The point is that US imperial strategists have this intractable contradiction that they're facing, which is that they want to maintain what they call full spectrum dominance. Or if you go back to the Wolfowitz doctrine in the 1990s, after the overthrow of the Soviet Union, US imperial strategists said quite clearly, we must prevent the emergence of any near-peer strategic competitor. We cannot allow any country become as powerful or nearly as powerful as we are. So we must do whatever we can to divide the different powers and divide Russia and China from Iran, divide Russia from China, try to create more conflict between India and China to try to break up institutions like BRICS. These are the kinds of policies that are discussed in Washington, sometimes quite openly in think tanks like the Atlantic Council. And when it came to the pivot to China, all of what the Obama administration was doing was trying to isolate China to prepare for war on China. But for a variety of reasons, they were unable to do so, which ultimately reflects the fact that the US empire is not omnipotent. They cannot maintain control over every region of the world. They can't try to control all of Latin America, all of Africa through AFRICOM, all of West Asia through these constant wars, using Israel as a launch pad to wage all these wars in the other countries in the region. And now, of course, in East Asia. And of course, Eurasia with Russia and Ukraine. I mean, despite the fact that the US has this Rumpelstiltskin policy of being able to print dollars, which is the global reserve currency, and export inflation around the world, and doesn't feel it in the way that other countries don't have that ability to do. And, Janet Yellen, the US Secretary of the Treasury, she famously said a few months ago, she said, yeah, we can afford funding these different wars because, of course, the US can just print the money that it needs to fund these wars. But the reality is that despite the many advantages that the US built for itself when it built its empire, this imperial infrastructure after World War II, it's not omnipotent. We see that in Latin America. The resistance forces, the anti-imperialist forces have always rebelled against US imperialism, whether that's Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Bolivia. Across the region, they always have failed to try to colonize Latin America. We see that especially in West Asia with the resistance forces in Palestine, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Iran, and Yemen. We see that increasingly in Africa, in the Sahel, in Burkina Faso, and Mali, and Niger. We see that certainly in East Asia with China on the rise, Vietnam on the rise, and many countries simply saying, even if we're not going to openly challenge the US empire, we want to at least have our own independent development path, and we want to pursue non-alignment to create a more democratic world order, which many people in the global south have been referring to as a multipolar world. But you can also really think about it as the kind of new non-aligned movement trying to revive the spirit of the Bandung Conference of 1955 and create alternative financial and economic institutions so countries can finally pursue some kind of alternative economic path, whether that's socialist, whether it's some kind of nationalist path like we see in countries like Indonesia, like we see increasingly in Latin America and as well. I mean, the reality is that the US-dominated financial system is one of the strongest tools that the US empire had to impose neoliberal orthodoxy in countries, especially after the overthrow of the Soviet Union. There were really no other economic alternatives for countries. Any country that tried to pursue an independent economic path was put under brutal sanctions and a blockade, like Cuba, or was overthrown, like former Yugoslavia in NATO, US-NATO wars. We're finally getting to a point where, again, there are these alternative infrastructure and institutions being built that allow alternative paths of development, and the US is desperate to try to snuff those out, to destroy all of them. But it's, again, facing this intractable contradiction because the resistance has grown so much in so many regions that the empire can no longer hold everything together. And it tries to move forces to East Asia, but then it loses more and more control of West Asia, the so-called Middle East. So then it has to bring forces back. So it can't. And then in Latin America, there's constant rebellions going on. Now in Africa, their forces are kicking out the French neocolonial forces and the US neocolonial forces. So at some point, the system is going to break. What concerns me, though, is that I think some extreme hawks in Washington recognize that their days are numbered. Their empire no longer can try to maintain unipolar control over the world like it had, or at least it tried to impose in the 1990s. What concerns me is that they think that their calculation is that in this historical moment, if we wait another decade, we will be too weak to try to decapitate China. So instead, what concerns me is that some of these extremists say we should act now, war on China, World War III, because otherwise it means the gradual decline of our hegemony.
Yeah, and of course, Netanyahu and the Israelis don't want the U.S. to pivot to Asia or anywhere else. The Israelis have a very particular interest to maintain U.S. focus on Israel's agenda in the Middle East. And as a consequence, that sort of connects the United States to a strategy it can't avoid. There is the other factor, which of course we saw on October 7th, and that is that the Palestinian resistance movement, in spite of all obstacles, won't stop fighting. And the Israelis and the Americans can say, well, October 7th was a terrorist attack, but in fact, the fighters who came across Gaza, across that border, across that wall, they were going into areas of Israel that had been Arab homes, Arab villages that had been burned down and destroyed by the Israeli regime. So this spirit of resistance on the part of the Palestinians won't die. There's solidarity from other Arab people and other peoples in the Middle East. That won't die. So this is a contradiction that U.S. imperialism can't escape, and that the Israeli regime, in spite of all of its military prowess, also cannot escape. Anyway, we're going to leave it right there. Ben Norton, I want to just tell people how to reach you or reach your website. It's geopoliticaleconomy.com, geopoliticaleconomy.com. Ben Norton, thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Brian. Keep up the great work that you do, and sending love to everyone at Breakthrough. It's probably the best media outlet out there, so keep up the amazing work.
Thanks so much.